Monism describes any systems which deny a multiplicity, a pluralism, or dualism between things. This can include between matter and immateriality, soul and flesh, object and subject, and so on. Reducing the antithesis to the other, or merging them, is monism. Examples such as Hinduism and Buddhism hold a mystical form of monism, whereby all sense experience is essentially maya, or illusory, or illusion to those who are fooled by it. Change, plurality, and causation are not real. The only reality is a unified one. All gods and beings are simply facets and extensions of the one singular thing or entity. In this sense, Hindus are modalistic polytheists, as opposed to classic polytheists, seen in the ancient Roman and Greek cultures. Ancient Greeks, such as the Eleatic school, determined that sense reality is untrustworthy, and that reason alone is unreliable, and so denied that change and origination do not really exist. They would be monists. Parmenides of Elea was one such notable figure. The Neoplatonists were strict principle monists, whereby all that is proceeds forth from the one true first principle of consciousness. Another example would be the German philosopher Hegel. He was an absolute idealist or rational monist, and he postulated reason as the substratum of all reality, where spirit is the endpoint of the development of nature. It is reason realizing itself. Monism takes numerous forms, and many traditions have utilized monistic languages and ontologies to explain reality. Two forms are existence and priority monism. The more simple of these is existence monism, whereby only one concrete thing exists. No distinction exists in any sense. All perceived distinctions or changes are purely illusory or apparent. The more academically rigorous form of monism is priority monism. Only one fundamental entity exists in this model, and they do allow for other objects with proper parts to exist, but only as derivatives of the one. This whole is prior to the parts, and typically the fundamental concretum is the cosmos or the universe itself. Thus, monism is often associated by materialism as an adjacent belief. We will begin by refuting existence monism with the epistemic problem. Premise 1. In existence monism, only one entity exists, and all distinction is inherently illusory, that is, that it isn't real at all. If distinction is merely illusory, it has no basis in being, that is, apart from being a false perception to us. All arguments, therefore, presuppose distinction in some way. Premises, for example, are different from conclusions, and opposing arguments are necessarily distinct from one another. Otherwise, there would be no distinction or difference between their contradictory conclusions. Therefore, if monism were true, there couldn't even be an argument for monism, as an argument for existence monism would be equal to an argument against it. And yet there is another large issue for existence monism, the ontology problem. Premise 1. Being is that which exists, and has attributes and predicates, that is, we have properties and things we can say about said being. If a being lacks predicates or attributes, we cannot properly describe or say anything about them at all. If a being lacks predicates or attributes, it cannot be a being. Nothing refers simply to a lack of predicates or attributes, that is, pure nothingness. Being as such in this way is a prerequisite for distinct objects, and to be is only possible when speaking of objects with attributes. If monism were true, that is, if existence monism were true, the one object would exist in simple unity. No attributes or predicates exist, as they are the precondition for distinct objects. And yet, unity as an attribute also fails, as simply appealing to monism to prove it would be a circular argument. And attributing unity to the object presupposes that it is not a multiplicity or plurality. Thus distinction exists, which should be impossible in existence monism. Therefore, an existence monist metaphysic is impossible, and must be described as nothing, as the one existent object lacks any true attributes. Next, we will take a look at the more academically rigorous form of monism, priority monism. The bigger academic challenge is that of priority monism, which escapes the pitfalls seen in existence monism. For the priority monist, they claim one fundamental entity exists. This is usually called the cosmos, the universe, or the whole, of which all proper parts are merely derivative. While theists would agree that God is the fundamental being that exists prior to all else, the priority monist is typically a materialist in their ontology. Thus, the most prior concrete thing that exists is simply material, just as individual things are. This makes priority monism susceptible to the same critique made against materialists, Stoics, and Epicureans. The first issue is that of Aristotle's issue of the unmoved mover, the one which must be immaterial, eternal, atemporal, and which is fundamentally unified and yet distinct from all physical matter. Priority monists have no real answer to this, unlike the Christian doctrine of God. Thus, the fundamentalist object cannot be a closed system whereby a whole gives rise and produces all parts, but rather the uncreated fundamental object must be a different entity from the cosmos and all of its parts altogether. Another sweeping issue is that of the immaterial. In fact, all abstracta and qualia and all immaterial things cannot be derived from a merely material world ontology. This is either thrown out the window, ignored, or chalked up to weak arguments stating that abstracta and immaterial things such as consciousness are merely just facets or illusions produced by matter. The new atheist movement and figures such as Daniel Dennett have pushed this notion. Thus, while there is one fundamental being prior to all contingent beings and objects, these are a plurality of objects, and the first principle, or one concrete object, is necessarily not in an entangled system with all other objects, against the teaching of Jonathan Schaffer. Nor is it created, or rather creating all other objects from an overabundance, against the monism of Plotinus. And therefore this first object cannot be physical. Thus we say God, the thing prior to all things, is outside the universe. He is not a whole, and the stuff in this world is as his proper parts, but rather they are distinct objects necessarily. Thus priority monism is also false. The Creator is necessarily of a distinct ontology from all other mutable things and objects in existence, so not even a rigorous priority monism is sufficient to explain reality. It is worth noting that a Christian figure in history by the name of Baruch Spinoza birthed a substance monism of the Christian variety, whereby only one eternal, infinite substance exists, God. Spinoza's unusual claim for only one substance was largely foreign to Western thought at the time, and he utilized the following argument. Every substance has at least one attribute. Two substances cannot share the same nature or attribute. God has all possible attributes. God exists. Therefore, no substance but God exists. For Spinoza, God, the one substance, has all possible attributes, and yet gives rise to any finite number of modes, that is, properties of stuff. This strikes many readers as quite strange. But more importantly, premise 2 of the argument is flatly false, as while two substances cannot share all properties as they'd be indistinguishable, they can share some and differ on others. The argument is therefore invalid. The huge problem with Spinoza's theory is that, like all monists, he denies God had any plan or goal for the universe. It exists as it could not fail to exist. It necessarily just exists. The Big Bang cosmology model, which shows that the universe was created, and all time and space was created at once, seems to obstruct this notion, and Scripture refutes this idea as well.